I'm very excited to have our first guest on, Dana Mills. She is the author of Rosa Luxemburg. She's also a college lecturer in politics at Hartford College at the University of Oxford. Aside from this, she has a beautiful career in dance. She was a fellow at the Center for Ballet and the Arts at NYU and a visiting scholar at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College in New York. Fascinating career. We should talk about that another time. But thanks for joining. I cannot think of a better topic for this moment, given the life of Rosa Luxemburg and the theories that she had and she pushed up against that were very nuanced and at a critical moment in the revolution. Of course, it ended in her execution. Yeah. But before we get to that, what inspired you to write this book?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I've become interested in Rosa about 5 or 6 years ago. I was looking into radical Jewish women, and especially women who rejected nationalism, who rejected a very narrow conception of the state. And she was an obvious person there. And I became more and more involved. And actually, the first ever book of Rosa I bought, I lived in New York during the Trump election, and I bought it in a stall, in a secondhand stall. It was 2 weeks before the election, and then I found myself reading her over and over and over during the women's marches, during everything that happened in 2016, 17. And she just became a very big part of my life. And the story of her life very much resonates with a lot of the discussions we're having today, both in socialism and feminism, in this intersection between both of them, and especially a kind of blanket refusal to accept nationalism as part of any emancipation movement. She was a pioneering racist. She was a pioneering environmentalist. When everyone was doing Fridays for Future, I was like, yeah, she did it first. She did it better. She did it in a very kind of forceful, intellectual, robust way, but still galvanized people around the agenda. And so she became my very close interlocutor and subject of a book. And just to end on like the contingency of her life and our times, in the way you introduced it, during the last Labour Party conference in the UK, the chief chancellor sent an email quoting her as like, this is the policies that we're going to outline. And I kind of thought, yeah, she's coming back. She's with us. She's very timely.
Let's talk about her life. What was the era that, for those who are new to her life, when was she born? What was the era that she lived during?
So she was born in 1871. She was a Jewish Polish citizen of the Russian Empire, which was then occupied. And her very first political education was in a party that rejected Polish nationalism as a teenager. And she saw the leaders of this party being executed. And that kind of galvanized a very strong defense of dissent, freedom of expression within the left, within the Marxist movement that she was always a part of. She did a PhD in economics very early on, got her PhD in 1897, one of the first women to have a PhD at all in the world. And then moved to Germany and became a leader of the German left there and became the left marker, really, of the SPD, which was then the biggest socialist party and also the biggest party in the international socialist movement. And she was one of the first people to object to imperialism, one of the first people to object to the First World War. She spent most of her adult life in and out of prison for her objections to the war. And she was a very powerful and prolific commentator on Marx. She was one of the first people to really respond to him fully. Very rigorous economic political thinker, ahead of her time in many ways. And she was both an agitator, a theorist, very, I would say, emotionally deep person. She suffered from depression. She suffered from ill health all her life. She was disabled. So she had a lot of things.
Injury, right?
Yeah. And she walked with a limp. And I think one of the things that really drew me to her, I realized very early on researching the book, is that she really loved walking. And she used to kind of get to know her comrades while walking with them. And she didn't care that they saw she was disabled. And I thought that tells you something about the kind of person she was. Because there was no pretense. There was no kind of, I'm trying to be someone I'm not. She had a lot of things against her. She had a lot of stakes against her. And she just mobilized for emancipation for all, which I think, again, is very timely in this moment when we're trying to think about how do we act for equality for all? How do we reject oppressions of all kinds? And it's kind of not bit by bit. We have to talk about everything all of the time. And we have to think about an overarching structure that were really allowed for emancipation to happen.
So, I mean, for those who are not, educated in the nuance of Marxist theories, I mean, she was critical of Marx, but aligned with him. Can you explain the differences between?
Yeah. So Marx is actually one of the first theorists of globalization, and he's the person who explained how capitalism is the system that connects us all through trade, through exchange of money, through exchange of goods. And she took that theory one step further and explained that imperialism is the way to sustain capitalism. Because the way that imperialism works is that nation states go abroad, exploit other areas of the world. At that point, there weren't even nation states, and thus kind of expand their markets into different areas of the world. So she created a very important connection between imperialism, which was a big problem of her time, as it is of our time, and the expansion of capitalism, and explaining why hasn't capitalism come to an end. Marx, in his time, died in 1883. He thought that capitalism will get to a crisis, and then we will move to the next stage, which is communism. But he showed how the expansion of nation states into new markets actually prohibits from this crisis to happen. And so if we want to create this revolution, if we want to create this change, we have to go against imperialism, which is one of the key points. And the other thing in which I think she's really important and also, again, very relevant for her time is that she was a key defender of democracy on the left. She was a key defender of exchange of opinions. She was a key defender of freedom of speech. One of her most famous quotes is, "Freedom is always and exclusively the freedom for the one who thinks different." So it's not about defending the common views. It's not about going with the flow. She always stuck out. She was always to the left of everyone. And many things she was proven true. She saw the ills of the First World War. She saw the devastation it would cause. She wrote very passionately against it. And she lost one of her lovers, actually, in the war. That's a little known fact I discovered. And it kind of was a huge trauma for her. But she really did not take common opinion as something that would structure her thought. And I think in that she had more nuance than Marx, actually, and she pushed Marx's thought there.
And on that note, I mean, if I'm understanding this correctly, when she brought in the imperialist mindset, it wasn't dependent on labor in these, right, the labor forces of expansion of essentially colonial power, right?
Exactly, yeah. So the idea is that why has capitalism in the West not collapsed in her time? She's writing several years after Marx has died, and one of her chief enemies throughout her life basically says there won't be a revolution because capitalism has ameliorated tensions and we will just live in capitalism from here to eternity. We just have to give workers a bit more rights, and then we'll appease them a little bit. We'll give them better working hours. We'll give them a little bit of better pay. She was insisting on revolution. She was a key theorist of the revolution. And she basically said that because markets can expand to areas in which the West hadn't thought that, she writes about places that she never visited. She wrote about the American South. She wrote about Australia. She wrote about South Africa. She never left Europe. She couldn't travel. She was, as I said, she was frail. She was, most of the time of her life, she was in prison. But she was able to understand that markets go elsewhere in order to sustain capitalism in the West. And that's why she says, in order to push for revolution, we need to push against imperialism. We can't allow countries to expand to new markets and saying, oh, yeah, but we'll work on socialism internally, which I would say then as now is kind of a weak feature of the left, saying, oh, yeah, we'll just sort out the sort of internal national policy. And then you'll go and fight a war and it's fine because it's different people and we don't know them. And, there's all the racist intentions behind it. And she kind of untangled that very, very early on. Really.
And she was for a general strike?
Yes, she was. She saw revolutionary changes happening in strikes, both economic strikes and political strikes. And she was involved in both Russian revolutions. The first Russian revolution, she actually went over and tried to see for herself what was going on. This is the revolution of 1905. Mm-hmm. And she saw that education of working class people happens through a strike. So what happens is the first person who leaves the factory and then people after them, there's a certain shift of consciousness that will allow for a revolutionary change. And I would say, and just looking at what's going on in the US right now in the past few years and, massive strands of strikes, this is exactly what she's writing about, how people's consciousness can change through the act of strike itself. So it's not kind of, again, bit by bit, but rather the process happens, starts from a strike, and then can expand to a more overarching change. So the other thing is she was very much against conservative trade unions of her time, sort of leaders who said, oh, we'll give you a few rights, we'll defend several sort of community rights, but we'll still keep capitalism and corporate the way that they are. And she pushed towards kind of an overarching revolutionary change.
So why was it at the time that some communists or otherwise criticized her, saying it was a naive approach? Because it seems very similar to some of the approaches we're taking right now, as you mentioned.
Well, first of all, I think she was ahead of her time, and a lot of times people just don't see outside of where they are. I think one of the things that, as an author, as someone, I'm also on the board of her complete works, which is a joy because it's something that it keeps revealing itself. We still haven't read anything of what she's read. I mean, what she's written. I mean, I worked with several texts. It's a short biography, but we keep finding new texts. We keep finding new insights. For years, she was criticized for not having a view of policy, of not having the view of the day after the revolution. That is not true. She wrote a lot about that. Some of the things we're only now discovering. Some of the things haven't been translated because of influences of Stalin and others who did not really like her, did not like the defense of freedom of expression, and censored within her archive. So actually, this is a really exciting time to be talking about her, because only now we're starting to grasp the fullness of the archive and the fullness of the legacy that she left for us.
I mean, she was able to take it out of essentially a fixed theory into the actuality of how do you actually shift through strategy. I'm lots of words right now. So let's talk a little bit about her execution, because this is just as Hitler was rising to power.
So it's an interesting moment, because it's a little known fact that after the Russian Revolution, there was actually a revolution in Germany that failed because it became a very kind of centrist and, again, very kind of still imperialist and still defended forces that were part of the revolution, also were part of the defense of the First World War. And she was always opposed to that. She was always the left martyr of all that tendency. And what happens in that, there's a really interesting counter-revolutionary moment in which the kind of center-right, the center, I would say liberal right, and what then became the far right. So the people who were involved in her execution later became complicit and executioners for Hitler. So I read this, and I think it's kind of now starting to resonate. And again, a lot of the facts are only now coming up, and there's numerous research that I was able to feed off. Why is that? That's a great question, because German forces have been hiding them for a long time.
Because they were the Social Democrats, right?
Yeah, so her own party, SPD, was complicit in the murder. And the SPD is still, it's the sister party of the Labour Party in the UK. It's still a large party in the German parliament. And I was present in a few times when people were heckling authors for saying, this has been what's going on. There's still a lot of sensitivity around that. But I think one of the points she makes, which again really resonates, and another famous quote of hers is socialism or barbarism. The moment you waver away from the left and you become complicit with the center right, the shift to the far right is very quick. And again, just looking at the past decade and what's going on around the world, she really highlighted that. And the tragic thing is that she paid in her life for that. She saw the processes from the minute that you become complicit with wars, you become complicit with imperialism. The shift from that to violence internally is a very quick one.
And that wasn't even the most radical thought at the time. But today, no.
That's the thing. She's still radical. That's the thing that was amazing about writing about her, is that she's still so radical and she still so much resonates. And a lot of the processes she describes, I was reading them and I was thinking, yes, this is happening now. And we should read her, because she really outlines how when you start giving up on certain freedoms and certain, I would say just no pasarán, like don't pass this line, then the road from that to internal oppression, to violence towards yourself really is a very quick one.
So can you give some examples of that, the types of freedoms that she highlighted?
So first and foremost, I would say freedom of expression. Again, she is the theorist of talking about exchange of opinions. And she was an anti-racist. She talked about, again, how policies abroad might influence what's happening internally. But she is the theorist of what democracy might entail through a process of emancipation. So that is universal suffrage. She was a pioneer of that. She wasn't a suffragette. She wasn't defending women's suffrage at the time, but she defended universal suffrage, because if a working class man doesn't have suffrage, or if a colonial subject doesn't have suffrage, then there's no use in giving a white middle class woman suffrage. So it's the kind of interlinking of all these rights together. But yeah, I think the kind of just connecting all the dots between all these micro processes that happen at the same time, and just saying you can't give in on any of them, which is a really hard position to take, because, you know, policies are hard to maintain that way. But she really said you can't waver from that.
Her execution, it from my understanding and my reading, it just seemed to happen so fast. And you know, I guess maybe it's this romantic, not romantic, excuse me, but like the way that cinematic executions happen. There's a lead-in, there's a procession, there's a trial, and it just, and there were those things, but it was quick.
But it didn't happen, no. So she was taken alongside with her closest comrade at the time, Karl Liebknecht, to a hotel in Berlin, the Eden Hotel, where there was kind of central counter-revolutionary forces. And,
I'm sorry, real quick, just beforehand, why did they take her? What was the lead into that?
Because she kept pushing against the central, basically the government that was then in force. She kept pushing against them, and she galvanized people. She knew she was going to die. You know, it's very clear from her letters. She knew that people were after her. She lived in hiding for a very long time.
From the moment she was released.
There were signs against her. I think it was just common knowledge. Her secretary, her best friend Matilda Jakob, basically says, "They're after you. You know, you have to live on the run." And she changed this from hotel to hotel. The last few months of her life are very dramatic. She basically is hardly at home. She doesn't see her friends or comrades, and just organizes ceaselessly. And she knows that it's a matter of time until basically the executioners will get her. And the execution itself basically that's the thing, it's very murky because it was illegal. So basically the kind of proto-fascists executed her, but with what we know now, with knowledge of the SPD, of the ruling party. And at that point, she was already she was always controversial. So some people admired her and some people hated her. Because again, far-left women, hard to sustain that position. And she was humiliated, and her corpse, she was shot from close range on the Landwehr Canal just before midnight on the 15th of January, 1919. Her corpse was thrown into the Landwehr Canal, and that became kind of a symbol of a moment of break, really, in German history. And that was kind of very, I would say it's really hard to write about things like that. It's very dramatic and just shameful, and just removing all her dignity as a human being. And that's why, you know, when she says socialism or barbarism, it is that. It is barbarism. It's treating your fellow woman as nothing but a body that you can just throw into a river.
Was there public outrage afterwards? I mean, did it revive something?
No, it didn't revive anything. I think it just basically cleared the lines. And the tragic thing is, a lot of people say, and I partly agree, is that she would be the most forceful person to galvanize around resistance, and then she was gone. And many other people around her were executed closely after. So a lot of people were killed in a similar vein. And I think a lot of people think, and I agree, that this is the beginning of basically giving in to the far right in Germany. There wasn't enough resistance. There was public mourning. She was much loved and admired by many, and there were processions, and, you know, after she got the respect and the dignity afterwards. But at the time, it just created kind of a shift in what was happening politically in Germany. And she was probably the most effective person to stop that process. Then she was there.
Globally, how did people respond
to her death? That's a great question. She was really, really famous and effective internationally. She was an organizer in the Internationale, which was the foremost revolutionary organization of her time. And I would say historically one really a rare moment of international revolutionary organization. And there was huge mourning. One of her closest comrades, Sylvia Pankhurst, there's a new biography of hers by Rachel Holmes, which is just literally a week out. She ran an editorial on the front page of her newspaper, Workers' Dreadnought, was devoted to the two martyrs, Karl and Rosa. There was huge upsurge of grief. Lenin, who famously, there was a long debate between him and her. I kind of demystified that in the book. They were comrades. They had their ups and downs like everyone. but there was a lot of respect. It's very clear that he respected her thinking. And there is this kind of moment of acknowledgement of like, yes, this is happening in Germany. And from now on, the German left would be very different. So, it was a break really in the international socialist movement. And I would say it was a break in revolutionary history because she really stood for overarching revolution. And then from there on, there was a moment of, okay, we need to do things different. Then obviously there's the different international and things go differently in Russia. And then a whole new period comes into being. But that really is a moment in which everything shifts.
Before we wrap up, if you were to crystallize what she stood for as a lesson for today, today, what would you say?
I would say no pasarán. Don't give up on racism. Don't give up on capitalism. Just yesterday, in a similar Zoom to the one we're having, Palestinian revolutionary Laila Kali was kicked off Zoom because she was speaking with San Francisco State University. And, the censorship that we're getting through big tech, through all these things that we think are so efficient for communication, this is just capitalism. This is just barbarism. We need to be anti-racist. We need to be feminist. We need to be capitalist. We can't do it one thing at a time. We need to do that all the time. I think that's my lesson from her.
Before we wrap up, we have a quick question from our chat. Did Rosa Luxemburg ever work or meet with Emma Goldman? Great question.
Oh my God, that's such a great question. Thank you. Not to the best of my knowledge, because I don't think Emma Goldman was visiting at the time, and she never made it to America, which I think it's really interesting. She would have learned so much, because at that point, obviously, you have like a really big surge of socialist organization, etc. But there are really interesting parallels, obviously, for many reasons. But yeah, a dream meeting. Can you imagine how much fun they would have? How much fun we would have thinking about that?
Sounds like a great movie. Or they could have come on the show in 2020 for our Feminist Friday conversations. Before we go, you did this piece in Jacobin about rejecting imperial feminism, and it is a review of a book that just came out called Feminism Interrupted: Disrupting Power. We're hoping to have Lola. Hoping to have her on the show soon.
Great, but fabulous.
I know this is exactly kind of the space that we want to dig into on our Fridays, is really helping people understand the complexity of feminism and how class has been obviously extracted from it, from the idea of feminism. But folks, you can go check that out on Jacobin right now. But basic idea is
reject. So, I mean, Lola's book is really important because it's an intervention specifically in British feminism, which I think is very interesting because there's a really big blind spot in Britain about race. There's a really big blind spot about police brutality. There's the kind of naive approach of, this is going on in the States. This has nothing to do with us. Actually, in terms of statistics, Britain is doing worse in many ways than the US. Little known fact. There's a huge anti-trans movement, which is hugely problematic within feminism. And Lola really pushes the idea, the same idea I was talking about, like you can't do things at a time. And she writes about abolitionism, she writes about sex work. And I think one of the main lessons that I took from the book, and I kind of put center in my piece, is exactly rejecting the white imperialist feminism. In the UK, it was very obvious because there were only two women prime ministers, both were conservative. The second had a terrible resume as a Home Secretary of huge backtracks on immigration law, on treating refugees. A lot of the things we're seeing now in the UK are basically hilarious, sustained. And there was this kind of naive thing of like, but she's a woman, so we have a woman prime minister, and that's great.
They put on a T-shirt.
Exactly, and she wore this T-shirt that said, "This is what a feminist looks like." And then it was discovered that, of course, the T-shirt was made in some sweatshops for, people who are paid 30 cents an hour or whatever. And that's exactly it, right? It's like you get to do the feminist thing, but then other people's labor pays for that, and they get nothing out of it. Exactly. But I think beyond that, it's again about like not giving up on the most oppressed in society. And I think it's a really hard moment we're in right now. All of us in different ways. Every country experiences it in a different way, but really we have to defend the most vulnerable. whether it's what's going on right now, Black Lives Matter, ICE, all of these discussions in the US. In the UK, huge anti-immigration surge once again. The new Labour leader who basically gave a nationalistic, jingoistic speech, retreating. We had a moment of hope with Jeremy Corbyn. We thought, socialism was beyond reach. And now there was a backtracking of like, oh yes, but we're proud to be British. And you're like, yeah, I read that book. It's called History of the Empire. We do not want to do that again. We've been in that, I know about the 19th century. It wasn't great. Right. So I think it is really a moment that we have to insist on all these things and to backtrack from them and to really work internationally. I think one thing I learned from Rosa is I'm really appreciative of this conversation because we are dealing with so many relevant issues in different ways, but in similar veins. I think it's just really a moment to insist on internationalism.
Dana, amazing work. Great book, great piece. Check out her piece on Jacobin right now, Reject Imperial Feminism, and her book on Rosa Luxemburg. And I think it's out in the US, right?
It's out on the 14th of October. So you can pre-order and it will be with you all soon.
Just don't do it on Amazon.
No.
Exactly.
Buy from your local bookstore.
Yes, absolutely. Red Emma's actually is in Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh my God,
you can order
course.
from there. Yeah. If you have a chance to ever go there in person, maybe post-COVID, it's a dream bookstore. It's really lovely. So, All right. Thank you, Dana. Hope to have you back on.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.